Well, yes, first thing to be absolutely clear about this, it's not about dividing different nations. It's about separating various people, individuals, from the various nations. And the parabolic part of it is like just like a shepherd. And then he puts the sheep on his right hand, the goats on his left. Then the king says to those on his right, the good ones, come, you will bless my father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. These people are now in Christ. They're moving into Christ. They did something that was so right that they count as Christians here. And they say, well, how was this Jesus? And he simply says that it was the way in which they treated Christians that qualified them. And God can do that. It's not exactly the same way as we get in the kingdom now. I understand that. But these are individual human beings in a very special judgment. So it pays to be good to Christian people. In this case, it qualified them. They became repentant and they're fit then to enter the kingdom probably as mortals. And if so, in Isaiah 65, it says they would have a very long life. I actually know of a person who's 114 years old now. And some of these people, if they died at 100 in Isaiah 65, they'd be considered just a youth or even cursed. So longevity would be a tremendous feature. But these are people who are permitted into the kingdom on a different basis. So they're in Christ in a different sense. Relax. Let Jesus do this. Individual human beings, not one nation as distinct from another nation, not whole nations, but individual peoples from the various nations who qualify by having treated the Christians well. In so doing, you might as well say they treated Jesus well. That's okay. Why not? I'll allow for that. Otherwise, you have nobody in the kingdom to be supervised. If we all, as we all agree, the saints are going to manage the world, 1 Corinthians 6:2, that doesn't mean that immortals are going to manage other immortals. I don't think that's possible. No, you have to have a mortal population surviving, and they will survive into the kingdom on the basis of how well they will have treated Christians maybe in the previous Great Tribulation, which comes just before the setting up of the kingdom. I don't know exactly. But that's a special judgment. It mustn't be confused with the other way in which Christians normally become Christians. They can still get the same life in the age to come, but as mortals.
There's precedence for this throughout the Old Testament. If you research and study this a bit further, if you're not familiar with what we call the wider hope, it's not just Christians that will be in the kingdom, but Christians as rulers. We need someone to rule over. So there will obviously be righteous people. And this is reflected in an interesting passage in Psalm 47 for people to look at. So this is about the nations. All you nations, clap your hands, shout out to God in celebration, right? So this is the kingdom here. This is kingdom imagery. And then look at this as you move down. For God is king of the whole earth. It's interesting because in Matthew 25, Jesus calls himself the king.
Yes.
So he's obviously representing God, his Father.
Obviously. Yes.
And then God reigns over the nations, verse 8. God sits on his holy throne. Again, this is kingdom, the kingdom established. God is sitting on his throne through his son.
Yes.
If you want to see it that way.
Absolutely.
And then the key verse, 9, the nobles of the nations, or the princes of the nations, assemble with the people of the God of Abraham. Isn't that interesting? So now they have become incorporated, if you will, into the people of God as one peoples, if you will. Now this psalm is about Israel, of course, but now Israel, this is applied to the church.
In the New Testament, the God of Abraham is the God of the people who believed like Abraham, and that includes, as we now know, people of all nations. So not only Jewish people, originally it was those, but that has been, as you said rightly, expanded to include anybody who has the same faith of Abraham, the ones who believed the Abrahamic covenant of 3 Ps, prosperity, progeny, and property. We are now, as Gentiles, included in those by having the same faith as Abraham had. And what was his faith? He believed the promises. What is the Christian faith? Believing the promises in the gospel of the kingdom as uttered by Jesus. This isn't difficult. It wasn't meant to be complicated.
And another passage I love to show people, Anthony, is in Isaiah 19. If you read it as a whole, if you study this, it's about the kingdom, the nations being subdued and so on.
Yes.
And an interesting thing happens here, Anthony.
Yes.
So if you get down to the end of this prophecy, at that time, that's a code,
Mm.
right? Code
Yes.
language for
Future
the
time.
day of judgment
Yes.
and the day of the establishment of the kingdom.
Yes.
But look at this. At that time, there will be a highway from
Mhm.
Egypt to Assyria. Assyrians will visit Egypt and vice versa. They will worship together. If you know your history a little bit, these are mortal enemies of Israel in the Old Testament.
Absolutely.
Even today, right? They're
Today,
surrounded by enemies. At that
enemies.
time, there's that code language.
Yeah,
Israel will be the third member of the group. So this is like a United Nations.
absolutely.
Obviously, that's not the case right now, is it? And look
No.
at this, the Lord who commands armies, that's
Yes.
Yahweh, God, the
Mm.
Father of Jesus,
Yes.
will pronounce a blessing over the earth, saying, Blessed be my people, Egypt. An amazing thing. The work of my
Amazing.
hands,
Mhm.
Assyria. That's amazing because that's typically what we call language of the saints.
Well, whole nations, you did it very well. The whole nation of Egypt will be converted at that point. This is certainly not true today. This very material is on the news daily, currently, today. The Kurds are probably the descendants of the Assyrian, and the Syrian people, are enemies of Israel. That's not going to happen forever. So, what you've given us there is a beautiful picture of the millennial kingdom when Assyria, who, as you rightly said, have been inveterate enemies of Israel, will now, in that future time, in that day, at that time, become as a nation converted. And not only that, they will be able to get on with Egyptians, the people in the south. So you've got the north, the Assyrians, the south would be the Egyptians. And guess what? The whole nations are believers in the true Messiah, and they're all getting on happily. The people of today's politics would love to achieve this. I have to warn them. They're not going to achieve this kind of international peace until the Prince of Peace, the Messiah, comes back to change the hearts of these people and have a completely new system going on the earth. That's very exciting. That's the gospel of the kingdom.
That type of biblical truth
Mm.
should put a dagger to the so-called historicist or preterist view that the kingdom somehow either the church is helping to spread
Yes.
as if it's here,
Yes.
that it's here, which is the full-on preterist view, which is an aberration, if
Yes.
if anything, isn't it? To
Yes.
the
This is
gospel.
due to Augustine. I'm glad you mentioned that. Augustine is really one of the great rogues, I have to say this. He's the one who finds the millennial kingdom impossible.